Well, this is the book. Alan very kindly sent it to me, and it's a beautiful book. And Alan, many, many warm congratulations. I was reading bits of it in preparation for this conversation, and it's a wonderful mixture of history, of art history, geography, theology. And what I particularly like is that each time you are talking about a particular church, I feel I'm with you in the particular city and location, because you're constantly signposting. It's almost as if you're on Google and you have the instructions, which directions to go. And I was looking particularly at Hagia Sophia, and I just felt I was right back in Istanbul with you. So many warm congratulations.
Thank you.
And Alan, to start our conversation, people who are listening in may not know this, but you have 12 chapters in your book, and each chapter talks about a particular building. So I think the obvious place to start with you is, why those 12 buildings? How did you choose 12 buildings to, I quote the title, to write the history of the church through its buildings?
Well, very difficult to narrow it down to 12 examples, and very difficult to cover a history of the church through 12 buildings. So the choice had to be, and I knew that I would leave out everyone's favorite building. I had to keep reminding myself that I was writing a history of the church and not a history of architecture. So the main principle was that it should have both the temporal and a geographical spread, so that it would follow and give the main lines of development of the church over 2,000 years, but also follow the church as it spread round the Mediterranean and then round the world. So the selection had to cover all of that. And it's a tall order to summarize the book in 5 minutes, but I could go through the examples if you wanted me to.
Well, please do that. And perhaps as you do that, Alan, could you then also dwell with us in how you defined church? Because I find that a particularly interesting aspect of your book, what you actually cover under that heading. And perhaps you could just explain your geographical range and also the temporal range that you covered, and also the different churches and denominations and why you made those choices. That would be wonderful.
And when you say church, was that with a capital C or a small c?
Very good question. It was a very capital C, Alan. Yes. Very
capital C. How I define the church? Well, it is the body of people who believe in the coming of a savior who is Jesus of Nazareth, and of course, the diversity of belief is enormous, and it took some time for that to be narrowed down to a kind of orthodoxy.
Yeah.
So that is under discussion as well when the examples are being discussed.
Yeah, yeah. So would you like to explain why you go from one building to another? You start in Jerusalem, which is obviously a very good place to start, with the Holy Sepulchre. And can you just explain how you went from the Holy Sepulchre to the next church, etc.?
Well, discussing the Holy Sepulchre, I could have started, of course, with the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem.
You could indeed.
Which would have been very seasonal for now. But I thought that I would begin with what the Emperor Constantine described as the world's most miraculous place, which is where it's widely believed that Jesus was crucified, buried, and then crucially rose again as one of the fundamental tenets of the Christian religion. So to begin with that most miraculous place, then to follow the apostles when they took the church and Christianity to the heart of the empire, to Rome. And it's reputed that both Paul and Peter were in Rome and died in the Neronian persecution round about 64 AD. So once in Rome, then it was a matter of selecting out of the great number of churches in Rome, what would be the most representative. And it seemed to me that the authority of the Bishop of Rome rests so much on the Basilica of Peter in the Vatican that it really had to be Old St. Peter's. That is the Constantinian Basilica that was built shortly after Constantine entered Rome and deposed Maxentius, who was widely taken to be a usurper. So following Peter and Paul to Rome, and then St. Peter's was located at what was believed to be the grave of St. Peter himself, and that authority of Peter as the rock on which Jesus said he would build his church was taken as the authority of the Bishop of Rome, who was the successor of Peter. So Old St. Peter's seemed to be the most important church in Rome to discuss its history and what characterized the use and the particularly the pilgrimage that started to St. Peter's, to the grave of the Prince of the Apostles.
And then you move from there to Constantinople, don't you?
Yes, following Constantine, who once the church was established in Rome, Constantine left Rome and established Constantinople, the new Rome. And there he built Hagia Sophia, the first Hagia Sophia, which is supposed to have been along the same design pattern, the double-aisle basilica of his other great basilicas in Jerusalem and in Rome, there in his new capital of Constantinople. But what I write about in that chapter is not Constantine's basilica, but Justinian's basilica. Indeed. Because in 532, during a riot, the Nika riots, Hagia Sophia was burned to the ground, and the central ceremonial core of Constantinople was where the emperor enacted the authority that he had as the elect of God.
Exactly, yes.
To be at the center of empire, and the empire was to be a reflection of the court of heaven, with God as the emperor of heaven, and the imperial court was a direct reflection of that celestial court.
Yes.
So when Hagia Sophia burnt down, the big question was, had God abandoned Justinian? Now, to answer that big question, Justinian had to rebuild the ceremonial core of the city as quickly as possible, and to build the greatest building in the world to reestablish that he was the anointed of God as emperor.
Yes.
And in the course of that, he built the most astonishing building, which you have also seen.
Yeah, indeed. And what you do so beautifully in that chapter is to weave together the theology and the politics and the imperial side and the architectural side. And then, of course, Alan, you move on to Kiev and Novgorod and Moscow. So I think what we're showing our listeners is how the book really does cover a very wide geographical area. And also it does cover a number of Christian denominations as well. And so from what you've said, just before we go on to listen to a PowerPoint that you prepared for this evening, Alan, just say a few words about what buildings actually tell us, because it's a remarkable thing you've done here. You're telling the history of the church through buildings. How can you do that? What do buildings? What do buildings tell us? Can you just say a little bit about that before we go and see the video?
Well, buildings are about people. They're the physical evidence of the way people live and what they think is most important in their lives. And church buildings hold a fascination for the traveler, and when they were built, why they were built, and who built them come together to tell the story of the place, its community, and what they thought the church was about. When the community gathers, its members organize themselves physically according to the members' roles, which is reinforced by the layout of the church and the form of the architecture. It might rigidly be hierarchical in the arrangement of the seating and have restricted zones that may even be marked out in the pavement, or it may have privatized spaces, say in box pews with high paneling and doors on the box pews. Then again, it may be emphatically egalitarian with open benches facing inwards to reinforce community participation. The whole building may be focused on the altar and the font, which shows the theological centrality of the sacraments, or it may be focused on the reading desk and the pulpit, showing the power of the Word of God. The building may show 1,000 years of continuity, or it may show 1,000 years of change, or an interesting mix of the two.
Absolutely. And you've chosen to give us a taste of your book to talk about God's house in Uam. And just before we go and watch the video, why did you choose that chapter for this evening?
Well, I thought that Uam, being not very far from Oxford, and most of our friends joining us today are members of the college or know Oxford and know the countryside round. And also, a lot of the churches that I talk about are imperial or royal foundations. And I thought it was important to follow the church into the countryside and into the lives of ordinary people. And what's particularly interesting about Uam as an example of a parish church is that at Uam, you can see the way the church permeates every corner of the lives of the people, so that you have the school, which is for the education of the children of the parish and still functions in the same way. It's still the parish school. There are the almshouses next to the parish church for what was termed the indigent of the parish. It still functions in the same way. There are still people in the almshouse, and I think that one of the almsmen is actually with us tonight.
Oh, fantastic.
And then they are connected to the parish church, which also has the chantry chapel of Alice Chaucer, who was the granddaughter of Geoffrey Chaucer, the poet.
Well, I think, Alan, you've whetted our appetite so much. I just simply have to come in now and say to Emma, please, can you play the video, and then we'll come back and discuss more.
This presentation is the result of research for a book commissioned by Oxford University Press called A History of the Church Through Its Buildings, published on 10 December this year. Of course, in a book like this, many of the churches discussed will be royal and imperial foundations, but it's important to remember the reach of the church into the parishes and into the countryside. This parish is both emblematic of that work and very special. It is the parish of Ewelme in the Diocese of Oxford. What you see here is not only the parish church of Ewelme, dedicated to St. Mary, that appears above right. The whole group of buildings constitutes the foundation of God's house, including the parish school on the left, almshouses to its right, and the parish church above, with its chantry and monument to Alice Chaucer, Duchess of Suffolk, and granddaughter of the poet Geoffrey Chaucer. Ewelme lies in a fold in the Chiltern Hills, about halfway between Oxford and Windsor, which made it an ideal position for her husband, William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk, giving access both to the royal court at Windsor, where he was chief advisor to King Henry VI, and also to Oxford, where he was Lord Protector of the University. The road between Oxford and Windsor takes you past all that remains of the ducal palace below the road, to the medieval school above on the hill. Unlike so many schools of medieval foundation, this one still functions as the local parish school, rather than having become a grand public school like the contemporary Eton College, founded by King Henry VI himself. Still, the building you see here is itself a large and prestigious brick structure, proudly displaying the coats of arms of the Duke and Duchess, indicating perhaps that Duke William may have intended to connect the school to one of the colleges in his University of Oxford. Above the school, on the slope of the hill, is a contemporary medieval brick gateway, giving access to a small cloister of 13 almshouses. Opposite in the cloister is a stairway leading to the west door of the parish church. On entering the church, you pass the font, with a magnificent 10-foot tall cover, emphasizing the importance of the sacrament of baptism. On reaching the chancel of the church, you see this magnificent monument to Alice Chaucer, opening into the family chantry. This whole sequence constitutes the foundation of God's house. The statutes of the foundation were written between 1448 and 1450 by the Duke and Duchess, and they say that we will and ordain this foundation principally to God's worship and for the increase of our merits. So the foundation was to carry out perpetual acts of charity on behalf of the founders and their families. Babies were to be baptized, children were to be educated, and the poor and indigent of the parish were to be housed. More than that, the master of the almshouses and the master of the school were to be clergymen who would perform services and say masses, and the almsmen were to pray for the souls of the founders and their families. In this economy of salvation, the dead would employ the living to ensure a swift passage through purgatory. Though God's House at Ulm is a remarkable survival, it is by no means unique, with hundreds of schools, colleges, and almshouses of originally medieval foundation continuing to function throughout England, though usually under new statutes and often in reduced circumstances. Henry VI granted the then Earl and Countess of Suffolk the license to found the almshouses on 3 July 1437, when Henry was just 15. Then 3 years later, on 11 October 1440, aged 18, King Henry himself founded the King's College of Our Lady of Eton beside Windsor, to the praise, honour, and glory of the crucified, and the exaltation of the most glorious Virgin Mary, his mother. The provosts, priests, clerks, and choristers of the foundation at Eton were, and I quote, to serve there daily in the celebration of divine worship, and of 25 poor and indigent scholars, and also of 25 poor and indigent beadsmen, whose duty it shall be to pray there continually for our health and welfare, and for the souls of Henry V, Queen Catherine, and all their forefathers and the faithful departed, together with one master or teacher in grammar, whose duty it should be to instruct the said scholars in the rudiments of grammar. So the Royal Foundation was twice the size of God's House at Ulm, but constitutionally and in its purpose it was very similar, and what survived at Ulm is much closer to the original first intention than at Eton. The King's plans quickly grew in their scope. 6 months after founding Eton, on 12 February 1441, King Henry signed the letters patent for the King's College of Our Lady and St. Nicholas at Cambridge. It is possible the two foundations were conceived together, since the King's commissioners bought part of the site for his college in Cambridge as early as 14 September 1440. Though the original college was to be a modest foundation of a rector and 12 scholars, by July 1443, the then provost and scholars petitioned for a larger site. Huge estates were granted to the provost and now 70 scholars, and the king himself laid the foundation stone of this, its chapel, on St. James's Day, 1446. Among the king's commissioners to visit the next year was William de la Pole, now elevated to Marquess of Suffolk. William literally bought into the king's dual foundation by pledging 1,000 marks towards the building of the chapel at Eton, and by that time he may have been considering a similar arrangement between his own school and a college in Oxford. The chapels of Eton College and King's College, Cambridge, were to function as royal chantries, and the newly built parish church at Ulm provided a chantry for Alice Chaucer and her family. The tower is all that remains of the earlier 14th century church, and the north aisle, to the right of the photograph, is the result of a pre-1434 building program, and the south aisle and chantry chapel, seen on the left, was post-1437. The chantry chapel holds the tombs of Alice Chaucer's parents, Thomas Chaucer, son of Geoffrey Chaucer, the great poet, and his wife, Maud Burgersh, seen there, and of course, Alice's own tomb. As it is a family chantry, heraldry plays an important role, and early descriptions by heralds and antiquarians indicate that it once played an even greater role, both in the chapel and in the church itself. What remains are fragments of stained glass in the east window of the chapel and coats of arms on and near the tombs. Here you see Alice's mother's arms of Burgersh, seen on the left of the right-hand slide, and Thomas Chaucer's arms of Root, seen borne by the angel far right. Other coats of arms show their relationship with other great families of the land, including, in the next generation, the royal house, with John de la Pole, Alice's son, impaled with the arms of Princess Elizabeth in the left-hand slide. The family had become well connected, and William, the first Duke, had enjoyed the favour of King Henry VI. In 1448, Henry created William Duke of Suffolk. Then his fortunes were still on the rise, but political fortunes and life itself were precarious, and by the next year, 1449, English military losses in France, including Maine, placed him under suspicion, and there were political disorders directed against him. Despite the support of the king, he was banished and murdered on the way. The awful story of that dreadful day in May 1450 is recounted in one of the Paston letters, which say, "Some say he wrote much thing to be delivered to the king, but that is not verily known. He had his confessor with him, etc. And some say he was arraigned in the ship on their manner upon the impeachments, and found guilty, etc. And in the sight of all his men, he was drawn out of the great ship into the boat, and there was an axe and a stock, and one of the lewdest of the ship bade him lay down his head, and took a rusty sword, and smote off his head within 6 strokes." Family connections were a rare source of stability in the shifting fortunes of this uncertain and violent world. William was accompanied by his confessor, so as always to be prepared for such sudden death, and the prayers of the faithful were paid for by the chantry, and good works, to the increase of our merits by which we hope for salvation, were the work paid for by the foundation of God's house. Having left a rich and perpetual foundation to carry out good works, prayer, services, and masses, the Duke could be confident to achieve the necessary tariff to pass through purgatory. But what was an adequate tariff? The statutes of the foundation stipulated a busy round of daily recitation of psalms and prayers and masses in what appeared to be a liturgical hyperinflation. On the other hand, many ordinary people concerned for the health of their souls joined religious guilds to ensure that at least the proper funeral rites were observed. 5 masses might be commissioned in honor of the wounds of Christ, or a Trental, which is 30 masses, might cost upwards of 10 shillings. 5 or 6 pounds would wage an annualer, that is a mass priest, to sing masses for a whole year. That would constitute a temporary chantry. But how could you be sure that even that would be sufficient unto salvation? The whole architectural arrangement of the foundation was for the propitiation of their sins. But a shift in theological thinking was already beginning to change the object and result of charitable patronage. King Henry VI's dual foundation of Eton and King's College developed quickly from being effectively chantries for the king and for his family to being much more outward-looking educational institutions. Lady Margaret Beaufort, mother of King Henry VII, had, when a child, herself been a ward of William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk, and, as a patron herself, had founded a chantry for herself in Westminster Abbey. But under the influence of Bishop John Fisher of Rochester, she founded professorships of divinity at both Oxford and Cambridge, and 2 colleges in Cambridge for teaching and also for preaching in the parishes, in the case of St. John's College. After her husband's terrible execution at sea in 1450, Alice continued her benefactions to the University of Oxford. In 1454, she gave the substantial sum of £20 towards the completion of the Divinity School. The Divinity School was used both for the teaching of divinity, for its debates, and for the secular administration of the university. The bosses of the vaulting commemorate the chancellors, vice-chancellors, high stewards, and proctors as officers of the university. Other bosses record benefactors, including archbishops of Canterbury, bishops, and Alice Chaucer. Alice's arms appear 4 times, and her son, John de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk, High Steward of the University, also appears once. The university arms only appear 6 times, only once more than the family of Alice. John de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk, whose arms are shown on the left, was married to Princess Elizabeth, sister of King Edward IV, whose arms appear on the central boss of the whole ceiling that you see on the right-hand side. The king visited the Divinity School in 1481 during its construction, while his nephew, Edmund de la Pole, John's son, was a student at the university. The king died in 1483, the year the vaulting was completed. As the last possible Yorkist heir to the throne, Edmund was in the end executed in 1513 by Henry VIII, grandson of Lady Margaret Beaufort. But that is to get ahead of ourselves. Alice will never have seen the vaulting of the Divinity School, since it was begun in 1480, and she had died in 1475. Not long before her death, she appears to have instructed the building of this tomb, entirely in alabaster. It is a formal, not to say hieratic, that is so distinctive as to be intended as a portrait. Alice wears the robes of the Order of the Garter as a member in her own right. Her feet rest on her heraldic beast, and her pillow is cradled by angels. Above her is a magnificent canopy. The tomb chest has ranks of angels bearing family coats of arms. The first angel bears the arms of her son John, showing his son John's claim to the throne through his mother, Princess Elizabeth. Alice was demonstrating her exalted position in society, but she was aware of how quickly even the mightiest, like her husband, could fall. Despite the outward display of worldly position, she allows the attentive visitor to see her private piety and her humility. At the base of the tomb chest, hidden behind the narrow tracery, is a cadaver effigy in the shadows. The weight of a dead hand is all that holds enough of the shroud in place to maintain the Duchess's modesty. Otherwise, her emaciated corpse is in full view. Eyes partly open, she faces the images of Mary Magdalene and John the Baptist, painted above her on the soffit of the tomb chest. The images are relatively crude and seen, so to speak, only by the deceased. So it is a very private and reassuring appearance by her patron saints and intercessors. The whole ensemble is a show of public dignity and at the same time very private and personal humility, faith, and hope. In the 15th century, the Church permeated every aspect of life from birth to death and beyond. It was a period of political and social instability when family fortunes and honors were amassed only to be seized, the holders to fall from power, often resulting in prosecution and even execution. Yet that was not the end, with purgatory still to be endured before the day of judgment. The Church had a role in all stages of this life, and in the form of a foundation like God's house, there was relative stability in a community rooted in place, but extending over generations of living and dead. Charity and liberality continued from generation to generation through the wealth of the endowment, and the thankful prayers of the living shortened the purgation and pains of the dead. And moreover, the priests of the chantries strengthened the ministry of the parishes. But this was a society on the cusp of change. Chantries, along with the monasteries, were going to be suppressed. But the foundation of God's house did not need to be suppressed, since it, along with the palace and lands of the de la Pole family, had been seized by the crown when they ended up on the losing side in the Wars of the Roses.